This is Module 4, Storing and Analyzing ATT&CK-mapped Data. Where are we in this process of applying attack to cyber threat intel? We started back with Module 1, focusing on understanding attack. Then we talked about mapping data to attack, both from finished reporting and from raw information in Modules 2 and 3. That brings us to storing and analyzing that attack map data here in Module 4, and then we'll move on to making defensive recommendations in the next module. Starting off with thinking about how we store attack-mapped intel. I'll be honest that the community is still figuring this out. The attack team doesn't have all the answers on this, and honestly, no one I've seen has the perfect answer. And part of that is because there are different requirements for why you might need to store attack-mapped intel in different ways. So in this section, we just wanted to give you some considerations to think about and some examples about how different folks in the community are doing this. First off, think about who's going to be consuming this attack-mapped intel. Is it a human or is it a machine? What requirements do they have? Again, humans and machines have very different requirements. Is something human readable or does a machine need to read it? That matters as you're deciding how you store this intel. Next, how do you provide context? We think that providing that context behind the techniques and the procedures is really important, so consider, could you include full text of a report? Or is there another way for you to capture that content? Similarly, how detailed is this intel going to be? Do you capture just the technique level, or can you get to that procedure level? And thinking about how you're going to capture that, whether it's machine readable or free text. Also consider how are you going to link it to other intel you might have. Maybe you need to know if a technique was used by multiple groups, or if it was seen in certain campaigns or incidents, or even linking it to atomic indicators like IP addresses or hash values. Lastly, think about how you're going to import and export data. What kind of format might your consumers of this, whether it's a human or a machine, need? Again, we just wanted to summarize some considerations to think about as you're storing this attack-mapped intel with the realization that none of us have it quite perfect, and all of our requirements for this are going to be a little bit different. You might want to start simply with something like Excel, the best CTI tool of all time. Attack itself started as a spreadsheet, so maybe for your team, putting that intel in Excel works for you. Maybe a wiki or MediaWiki works for your team. We replaced our old MediaWiki website with a new, shiny Styx taxi-based website a year or so ago, but maybe that wiki works for your team to map that intel in a simple way. Doesn't have to be fancy. Sometimes things like wikis and spreadsheets, Confluence, any of those things can work for your team based on what you need. Now we're going to roll through some different examples about how folks in the community are mapping to attack. MITRE is a nonprofit and we don't endorse any particular company, vendor, or team, but we do want to share with you some different ways that companies and teams are mapping to attack to give you ideas of what you could do. First up, MISP, which is an open source threat intelligence platform. And thank you to Alexander, one of the developers there, who gave me these screenshots for this training. You can use MISP to map different information about incidents and events. And in MISP, there's a concept of a galaxy. And this galaxy contains different attack patterns, which are attack techniques. So you can say, for a specific event or incident, here are the attack techniques we observed in that incident. One thing that's powerful about MISP is that as a threat intelligence platform, you can start to link what you have about that attack technique to other information. For example, you could add a screenshot of the phish if the technique was spear phishing attachment, or you could connect that attack technique to other incidents, campaigns, or groups in MISP. One example from Anomaly, they have a weekly threat report and they summarize something that was in the news in the past week. And at the end of that summary, they list the attack techniques that they observed. Simple way you can add those techniques to the end of a report. McAfee is also mapped to attack. One approach they've taken is to list the attack techniques at the end of the report. And they haven't just listed the techniques, but also the procedure level detail. For example, commonly used port, they indicated the attackers used port 443, adding that extra detail. Next up, CrowdStrike, their Overwatch team, has done a lot of mapping to attack, and in one of their reports, at the beginning of the section, they highlighted the techniques they observed and then went on to describe the activity. So at the beginning of a report versus an end of a report. Next up, Digital Shadows. They mapped out different techniques from the GRU indictment to the attack tactic and technique, and then what they did was they added some additional information. They said, okay, there's the technique of trusted relationship. Here's some mitigation advice to add on to what that attack technique is. Next up, recorded future. They mapped different attack technique information from different groups, and by adding timestamps, they were able to create this cool-looking timeline of when different adversaries were active across time. Unit 42. They've also mapped to attack via their playbook viewers, and one thing they've done is included what they call indicator patterns, which has machine-readable text, things like process::command_line. Again, what we talked about earlier, you need to think about, is a machine or a human going to read this? And maybe this kind of format would work if a machine needs to read your data. The other thing that Unit 42 does is they sometimes link those atomic indicators to techniques. So in this example, the technique is standard application layer protocol, but maybe it's relevant to know that a certain domain name was used along with that protocol. So the Unit 42 team has tied that domain to that technique. Moving on to the attack team, the way we do this. On our website, we list the technique, for example, comm hijacking, and then we list in prose, APT28 has used comm hijacking for persistence by doing the following, and we always cite that back to an open source report. This is great for humans to read, and though you can pull this in sticks format, maybe it's not the best machine-readable information. So great for human analysts, maybe not for machines. At the bottom of the slide, this is more of a thought experiment. Something that I would love to see in more tools out there would be maybe including the full text of a report, like the example I have there from NCC Group on APT15. What you could do is then, as you mouse over the different sections of the report, the attack technique that applies could pop up on the right. So just a thought exercise on what else is possible as you're storing this attack-mapped intel. All right, so this section we're talking about storing and analyzing that attack-mapped data. So we talked about storing already, some of the considerations there, and we've decided how we're going to store it, but now what do we do with it? How do we do analysis and really make this real and actionable for our teams? Let's dive in here with an example. In yellow, we've highlighted techniques used by APT28 based solely on open source reporting we've mapped. Now that's a really important asterisk because we don't know everything APT28 has ever done. No one really does, so that's an important caveat. This isn't everything, but based on open source reporting, this is what we know that the attack team has mapped. Those techniques highlighted in yellow using a tool called the Attack Navigator that we'll dive into in this section. Next up, similarly in blue, we have the techniques that have been used in open source reporting that the team has mapped by the group known as APT29. Now, since these techniques are structured in the same way, using that common language of attack, what we can do in the Attack Navigator is overlay that information. So in yellow are the techniques used by APT28, in blue the techniques by APT29, and then in green are the techniques that have been used by both groups. Again, this isn't perfect, and maybe groups change up their behaviors over time, we know that, but looking at past behavior can be a place to start. A lot of folks we talk to are really overwhelmed when they look at attack, and this is a way that you can start to go from the hundreds of techniques in attack to narrow that down and say, maybe these are the two groups we care about, or there are other groups that we think are a high threat to our organization. Let's focus on the techniques that we know they've used in the past as a way to prioritize where we start. And prioritizing is what cyber threat intelligence is all about. From there, we can go a step further. Maybe our teams have done an assessment across our environment and said, okay, this is what we know about the techniques we can and can't detect. You can overlay that with what you know your threats have done and start to say, well, maybe these are the 5 techniques that we know both of these groups have done, and we know that we have gaps here. We don't think we could detect these techniques. This is a great way to start to prioritize where you start with attack so you don't have to be overwhelmed. You can use a threat-informed approach to figure out where you can start. To create those visualizations, I use Attack Navigator, which is an open source tool that MITRE created, and it's a great way that you can get started with storing and analyzing attack map data in a really simple way. It is open source, so you can customize it, you can pull it down, make it your own, and it's a simple way that you can visualize different things about attack techniques. I'll now give you an overview of the Attack Navigator and explain some of the features of it and how you can use it to do what we did in the slides and compare different group techniques. So Attack Navigator, just like Attack, is free and open on GitHub. You can pull it down, you can use it locally. Lots of info here, our changelog, a README. We also have a hosted instance. If you don't want to have to pull it down, maybe you're not a developer, you just want to get started using it, cool. We have a hosted instance for you that is linked to from this usage section. So this is what the Attack Navigator looks like by default. We also have a version for mobile attack, but this is automatically displaying enterprise attack, which you'll recall is kind of how the adversaries get in and what they do after they've gotten in. So you'll be pretty familiar with this view, right? It's the attack matrix. Across the top, we have these tactics, the adversary's technical goals, and under each of those tactics, we have techniques, right? How those adversaries achieve the goals. In a navigator, we have this object called a layer, and right, that's just a way that we can capture different information about these techniques. So I'm going to walk you through these different buttons we have across the top, and then I'm going to take you into a use case for Navigator based on threat intelligence. So let's dive in. The first control we see is locking multi-tactic technique selection. What's a multi-tactic technique? Well, you'll see in Attack, some techniques, like for example, access token manipulation, fall under multiple tactics. It's a multi-tactic technique. And by default, Navigator will select both of those techniques across the tactics, but you might say, well, I only want to select one of them. Cool, Navigator gives you that option. I just care about access token manipulation under privilege escalation or defense evasion. Easy enough. Then we have the search menu. For example, if you want to see all techniques that mention registry, you can do a quick search and those will pop up. You can also do multi-select. So this allows you to select either groups or software, which you'll recall we have pages on our Attack site where we go through open source reporting and get examples of different groups and software using attack techniques. Really important to note that this is not all-encompassing, right? We can't possibly map everything these groups have ever done. We don't have that visibility. But we take a sampling based on limited open source reporting that we map. And so in Navigator, you can select different techniques that the groups or the software pages we have in Attack. So we can go ahead and select, for example, copy kittens or deselect those. Next up, the deselect, right? If I have techniques selected, I want them to not be selected anymore. Pretty self-explanatory. Next up, we have layer controls, right? Navigator thinks in layers of information. So good analysts always give context about what they're doing. So, maybe I add a name for this. I'm going to call it APT329 comparison. And I'm going to give some awesome description about what I'm doing so that other analysts who look at this know what I mean. You can also download layers. Behind the scenes here, this is being built in JSON. So let's say you want to take your layer here and export it to another structured format or another tool. Great, you can download the layer as JSON. You can also export your layer to everyone's favorite analyst tool, Excel. Get a lot of requests for people who say, hey, I'd love a matrix in Excel. This is an easy way to do that. We all have PowerPoints we have to make, presentations, maybe you want an image of the navigator to include in your presentation. You can also render your layer to SVG, an image type, and then you can include it in your presentation to make yourself look really awesome. We can also filter, right? Maybe we want to only select Linux techniques or Mac techniques. This is also where if you want to focus on pre-attack techniques, you'll recall pre-attack is left of exploit. What do the adversaries do before they've gotten in? You can select prepare, and then act is enterprise attack, which is what we have up right now. Next up, you can change how you sort the techniques. Maybe you want to alphabetically or reverse alphabetically or in terms of the score, ascending or descending. Totally up to you. You can toggle that there. You can also set up colors here. Now, for example, maybe I want to change this tactic row background to a different color because blue is my favorite color. You can do that there. We'll also dive into this in a little bit in our threat intel use case about how we can make this gradient for different scoring. Moving along, we have this toggle view mode. By default, you see the full technique names, full tactic names, but maybe I just want to see the first letters of those. Or I just want to see little rectangles if I want to visualize something, in a simpler way. So you can toggle that there. Going into the technique controls we have, maybe I want to disable certain techniques. I don't want those to be in my view at the moment. I can go ahead and click toggle state and it'll gray it out and it won't be part of my view at that moment. And then there's a separate button for show and hide disable. Maybe I don't want it to be grayed, I just want it out of my view. Click the show or hide disabled and it'll pop up or back depending on what you need. Next, background color. Let's say access token manipulation, our team knows that this is a technique we have no coverage on for defense evasion. So we can go ahead and make that red. You can also give it a score. Let's say this is a high priority one, we have no coverage. Maybe we give it a score of 0 or 1 or 2, whatever you've decided for your team. You can also put a comment. So, maybe we want everyone to know we need to focus on this. So you can add a comment. And when you do that in Navigator, this yellow underline is going to pop up on your technique. So that's how you know there's a comment in there. And then last, clear annotations on your selected techniques. So, okay, access token manipulation, we want to clear that one. Easy enough. So that's an overview of the Navigator controls. So now I want to dive into a use case, specifically for threat intelligence. I think ATT&CK is a really useful tool you can use to look at adversary behaviors, kind of look at what groups and software are doing, and then prioritize based on that. So I'd previously written a blog post where I showed you this kind of cool overlay and Navigator with different techniques, different colors, and I wanted to dive into how I actually created that. So we're going to go ahead and create a new layer. Click on this little plus sign, create new layer. And this layer, I'm going to select APT3 techniques. So I'm going to name it APT3. Maybe I would add a little more layer information in here, give some more context on what I'm doing. I'm going to go into the multi-select menu, and I'm going to scroll down to APT3 and select, again, remembering these are just the techniques that the team has mapped based solely on open source reporting, but it's things that we know APT3 has done in the past. And I'm going to go ahead and give that a score. So I'm going to say for each of these APT3 techniques, give that a score of 1. Great. Now I'm going to create another new layer, and I'm going to name this APT29. I'm going to repeat the same process, going through selecting APT29 techniques, and then this time I'm going to give these a score of 2. Easy enough. Okay, so now I have 2 separate layers with techniques for APT3 and APT29. So next, I'm going to magically combine them with the Create Layer from Other Layers option, which is one of the options when you create this little new tab here. So Create Layer from Other Layers. When I click on that, these yellow rectangles are going to pop up. It's going to tell me what Navigator is identifying each of these layers as, what letter, so A, B, and C. So in this case, I want to compare B and C. So in that score expression, I'm going to type B plus C. I want to bring in the information from those 2 layers. Lots of different options you can input here. You can check out the help menu for more on that. Help menu is up here in the upper right. And once I've entered my logic, I'm going to just click Create. So now to help me keep track of what I'm doing, I'm going to name this, right? Like a good analyst, I'm tracking what I'm doing, and I'm not making typos. APT3 plus APT29. And right now, you're kind of like, wait, these are all red. This is not helpful. Well, if you scroll over, what you'll see is the scores are actually different, right? You'll remember we assigned 1 for APT3, 2 for APT29, and then adding together, 3 is going to be the score for techniques that both groups have used. So what we can do is we can go to this color setup menu and say, okay, for my scoring, my low value is going to be 1. That's APT3. My high value is going to be 3 for both groups, and then my middle value obviously would be 2 because that's halfway between 1 and 3 last time I checked. So let's go ahead and select colors for these. In this case, let's choose the default yellow for APT3. You can also specify hex if you have a specific yellow that you're hard to set on. Let's choose blue for APT29, and then yellow plus blue equals green. Cool, so let's make green both of those groups. So then if I click off of that, I can see my APT3 techniques in yellow, my APT29 techniques in blue, and then the techniques that both groups have used based on OSINT reporting we've mapped is 3, and those show up in green.
Now that you understand a little bit about how to use ATT&CK Navigator, that brings us to exercise 4, comparing layers in ATT&CK Navigator.
All the information you'll need for this exercise is in the same place you've been going to, attack.mitre.org/training/CTI under the Exercise 4 section. If you'd like a detailed step-by-step walkthrough, you can find a PDF called Comparing Layers in Navigator that'll walk you through exactly what you need to do. And then there's a separate PDF called APT-39 and Cobalt Kitty Techniques that lists the different techniques that you'll be using to create those navigator layers. Here are the overall steps you're going to be taking in this exercise. First off, you're going to open Attack Navigator from that bit.ly link. This is the hosted instance of the Navigator, but you can also pull it down locally if you prefer. Next, you're going to create 2 separate layers. And in those layers, you're going to select the techniques that have been used by APT-39, as well as Cobalt Kitty, which is known as the group Ocean Lotus. You'll be selecting those techniques in separate layers and giving them some kind of unique score. Maybe APT-39 has a score of 1, Ocean Lotus has a score of 2, for example. Then you'll be using Navigator to combine those 2 layers to create a third layer, using that combine logic that the walkthrough will explain. After you've created that third combined layer of the techniques that both groups have used, you're going to make it look pretty. Maybe you use blue for one group, yellow for the other, and then green for the techniques that both have used, but it's totally up to you. And then you're going to look at what are those overlapping techniques that both groups have used, with the idea that maybe those are the ones that your team should focus on trying to detect, mitigate, prevent, if these are the 2 groups that your team cares about. We now suggest that you pause to complete this exercise. Take about 15 minutes or as long as you need to complete exercise 4. Let's go over exercise 4, which is all about comparing layers in Attack Navigator. You started out by manually selecting the different techniques used by APT-39. Those are shown on the slide in yellow, but you created an Attack Navigator layer for this. You then created a separate layer with the Ocean Lotus techniques, again manually selecting those. We've colored those blue on the slide. You then used that combine logic to combine those 2 layers, and then you made it look pretty. You adjusted the colors to your preference. On the slide, we used green for those techniques used by both groups. In case you didn't finish, here are the 7 overlapping techniques that we found from comparing the APT-39 techniques with the Ocean Lotus techniques in Attack Navigator. You'll need these for the next part of our training, where you're going to be diving into making some defensive recommendations. As we start to wrap up Module 4, we've talked about a lot. We started off talking about storing that attack map data and how you have a lot of different considerations to think about as you do that. And those considerations or requirements aren't the same for every team. We then walked through how to analyze that data and gave you an example of how you can use that attack map data to start to prioritize what techniques your team should focus on in terms of defenses. So that was Module 4, and in our next module, we're going to put those techniques that we found that those groups have used into action to make some defensive recommendations in Module 5. That concludes Module 4.